Hey guys, and welcome to another Mass for the Dead video. In this video, I'll be giving you a guide or just an explanation on the new raid in the JP version of Mass for the Dead, which is the 2nd anniversary raid featuring Gargantua as the raid boss, which is pretty cool because I like Gargantua. So a little bit about the raid boss first. He is tech type with doing physical damage and the Dole tribe or race, and he has 50% resistance against earth, 25% resistance against fire, 10% resistance against ice, water, shining, darkness and poison, and 25% weakness to wind and thunder. So that is the current weakness that he has, which may change as in the future, but we don't know because JP Dev definitely likes to mix things up a bit. So status resistance wise, he is resistant to everything apart from curse, seal and paralysis. So the actual raid boss itself, his attacks are all AoEs with a few skill attacks that does a lot of damage. It is a AoE debuff and you might want to watch out for that. I'll show you a bit about what it is later on. But yeah, so firstly, I guess a little bit of explanation on the raid itself. It's a first guild raid with new guild features, and from what I know, you can't actually participate in the raid unless you're in a guild, so that's definitely something, which is probably why the participants for this raid is actually a bit lower than the usual participants they have for other raids in the past on the JP version. So yeah, the rewards. The actual points rewards pretty standard for all raid. However, for the ranking rewards, it's actually, I think this is a lot higher than what they usually are, which for first place you get 10,000, second and third 6,000 and so on. And yeah, and this will increase as boss dies more. And similarly, also the participation award for the boss dying, obviously I think it's 5 or 4 times the boss dies, the reward will increase by 25 medals. And on top of that, you also have the guild ranking, which is pretty cool, especially for the first place. Like, that guild icon is just perfect. Yes. Second place as well, Gargantua icon, that's also really cool. And Hemsky is pretty cute as well. So other than that, these are the icons you would get. Basically, once you're below 100, it's just the Hemsky. And if you're in a guild, I would say if you aren't going for the top 3 positions for basically the bonus guild rewards and a lot more stones, usually for these I would just go for whatever icon you want. So if you like Cocytus more, maybe go for Cocytus, Shell Tier more, go for Shell Tier and so on, because the gold is the same and the only difference is 100 stones, but the icons are something you won't be able to get otherwise. So yeah, you probably want to talk to your guild about it, and that's about it for guild awards. For ranking, you can obviously view ranking from the usual ranking section. However, this time they did add a new section which is for guild ranking. So firstly, they have your ranking for the guild, and then they have the leaderboard for the guild, which only shows the top 10 guilds. There's also a ranking for everyone in your guild and how much damage they're doing as well. And yeah, that's about it for the basic guild features. Nothing too special, but it's pretty cool and competitive for guilds, and just fight together rather than competing for yourself. So shop, this time they have a lot of awards. So it's currently the ReZero collab, that's why they have Betelgeuse as one of the awards. And for Betelgeuse, it's definitely a lot cheaper compared to someone like the Anniversary Eins, or we're calling him Pimp Eins because he looks like an absolute pimp. Just look at him, pretty sleek. And yeah, so Betelgeuse, his exchange is the usual one, the same as Shiromochi and all the past guilds with characters. But Eins is a lot more expensive, so for a casual player, usually if you just participate in every raid boss, you should be able to get at least 1 copy of Irons. If you're someone who would want to spend a bit of pots and maybe go for a couple of placements, I would still go for 1 copy of Irons and maybe a luck 25 Betelgeuse or higher luck Betelgeuse if you don't have him already. But if you do, then obviously you go for the luck 25 Irons. Now if you want to go for luck 100 Irons, obviously you have to be a very big whale, someone that will probably be I'd say top 100 and top 30 in pretty much every boss if you actually want to get him at luck 100. But yeah, other than that, everything in the shop is pretty standard. Compared to global, obviously you don't get the large crystal, but it's still pretty good. Especially with the fact you actually can get characters. And yeah, I guess now I'll talk a bit about the raid character strategy. So I guess now I could probably show you the actual teams that you should go for and what the best characters are. Okay, so firstly, the buffers. In this raid, because of how the raid boss works, you don't really necessarily need a buffer, because if you don't know already, debuff actually gives you a lot more damage than buffers, unless it's crit, and even then, most of the times, debuffing is actually a lot better. So yeah, obviously for buffers, if you're going with one, and I'll basically tell you later on why it's a bit more difficult for this raid, and you don't really go with the standard comp because of what the boss does. But Debuffer S tier is obviously the character that does crit. Shell tier is a special case here because the boss is tech type, meaning if you have a full speed team, Shell tier's buff is so strong that it's essentially crit, and that's why she's also here. So from here, it's basically just characters that's doing crit. These two are Irons is magic and Locus is physical only. Mare is kind of, barely getting there, but he also does crit. So these are just characters that do around 30% attack buff, which is quite decent as you will reach close to buff cap, or for some characters you actually reach buff cap in just 2 turns, which is 75% attack buff. And B tier is just characters with 25. So basically, these I wouldn't recommend for you to use in this raid, because the raid boss is definitely something that kind of makes you need to switch up your team comp for a bit compared to the usual raid team. Now, the next I'll probably go on is DPS, since it's a bit easier to actually explain it. So for DPS, first off, these characters are ranked based on calculation data from their skill sets, which you can find on the offline site in the link in the description. And from there, based on the raid boss weakness and relics and other buffs, I kind of create a formula modeled based on damage testing and other stuff to create this and compare the damage. And obviously, game mechanic has a lot of hidden stuff, and it's not the most accurate representation, but it is somewhat something that can give you a decent guide. And yes, so here's the character tier list. The top 3 is drastically more different than everyone else. They actually do way more damage. And obviously, the 2 new units, which are the Anniversary Solution and the Anniversary Nabe. And their damage is, it's just insane. So, if you still have some stones and you aren't worrying about the upcoming collaboration for Konosuba, I would definitely go for them for this raid, because of the raid shop is just pretty good. So the reason why Solution is so strong is, if you have a look at her skill, her 4 MP is doing one of the highest neutral damage by itself in the game. And on top of that, she also has Dole Killer, which is what the raid boss is. And the thing about Dole Killer and just Tribal Killer overall, they actually do apply on somewhat to a sense of percentage wise. So she actually does quite a lot, like really insane damage. Similarly, you have Nabe, who has element advantage and will also do a lot of damage with her 3 MP and of course 6 MP, but I'll go on a bit later on how you could do that. And obviously everything else is just type advantage and element. And obviously once you go down to the good DPS, these are pretty much just, they're just high damage overall. And that's why they're mostly here. if a character you want to use isn't on the list, it usually just means they're worse than, you know, the bottom characters here. And yeah, you can still use them, but you know, by the time you get to this point, the DPS difference isn't really big enough for it to matter too much, so I will just use with whoever you have that's already leveled out. Otherwise, I'll probably, you know, look at if you have anyone from here and maybe level them up for the raid. So coming back to Nabe, on her 6 MP, she does have an advantage with Paralysis Killer, which gives her a lot more bonus. And funny enough, the raid boss is not paralysis resistance. So if you have a character that does paralysis, it will be very useful. Moving on to the debuffers. The top debuffers are just characters doing damage and above 30% debuff, which means they will reach cap in 2 to 3 turns. So the top, I'd say top 2-ish is just them. They're probably very comparable. Maybe the irons can be a bit better depending on your team. So once you go below, they're just other characters that do debuffs, etc, etc. Now, however, this is only for defense, and because of this raid, which has something a bit more unique, is the fact that the raid boss actually does quite a lot of damage, and he does debuff you for, I think, 40% all parameters, so basically 30% all parameter, I think 3 times in 5 turns. One of them is on the first turn, the other one I think is on the third turn, or maybe the second turn, and then you have one on the last turn. So if you don't have a character, like if your character's on strong, I'd say maybe above 7,500 HP, then most likely you would die by 10-3. So with debuffs then, you might not want to purely go with defense down for the damage. You might want to go with something more defensive, and such as I'd say attack down, which is the general one, or you could rely on things like seal and paralysis. So for that, obviously the top character would be Neuronus, because Neuronus debuff, although it is 50% magic, she also has paralysis and seal at the same time, which is really good, especially if you stack her, like if you combine her with Nabe, who is also magic damage as well. And yeah, it's pretty much the best combo you can do at this point in raid. And otherwise, other than that, obviously you have Irons. Irons debuffs everything at a pretty high percentage, and he also buffs your team as well. So it kind of cancels out with the debuff the raid boss does. From there onwards, you have Mari, which is just another character that does steal, but it is on a different scale, so you probably have to, you know, work around it and see what actually suits you. So other than that, once you go back down a bit more, you have Entoma, who also does steal, but at the same time also does a pretty good debuff. So from there, she could probably be S tier as well if you want to go with characters that are more defensive and actually helping your team survive, other than just relying on giving your team more damage. From there, you have probably Yoshino, you know, just other characters that mostly do attack debuff, etc. And you know, these characters. There's probably a few more, but yeah, basically you might want to look into the characters themselves and see what they do. Attack down is not as great as obviously seal, because seal prevents a character from just using the skill attack, which is the one that does the most damage, as well as the debuff that makes your team do less damage. But attack debuff is usually enough for your team to survive. However, for some weaker characters, maybe not. And the other one is paralysis, which is obviously the better one, but the boss does have a bit of resistance to paralysis for the first 2 turns, so you might want to be a bit careful with that. And yeah, basically the most recommended character to use in this raid is probably Neuronus, because of how versatile she is and the fact that it's basically made for her. And yeah, basically for the most optimal team that you will go for the raid, if you have every unit in the game, is probably Solution, Nabe, maybe Neuronus or Yuri, depending on how well your team survives, and Irons, and you probably, you know, just switch those around and see which one works the best. So skill sets wise, I'll probably only talk about the top characters for DPS, because There's too many to go through and most of them are fairly self-explanatory. Usually you just go and use your skill at which your debuff and buff is at cap if you're using a buffer. However, for, I'd say, solution, nabe is fairly simple. If you have a character that's doing paralysis, you would do 3 MP twice or 3 times. Actually, you do 3 MP twice, and then you would use your 6 MP for the paralysis killer. Solution is that she does have the overdrive passive, and she also has the 2 MP overdrive. So if you do have her at OD level 10 because of how overdrive work, where for every OD level you do get 25% more OD charge, more OD gain for OD level 1. If you have an OD level 2 solution or luck 10 solution, it means you will be able to use your overdrive in raid without compromising the damage too much, because you could do your 2 MP attack and then 3 MP attack 3 times, and then you will be able to use your overdrive. So Solution's overdrive, if you actually have a look at it, is a bit weaker. I'll just bring it up here. So Solution's overdrive at level 1 is only 165%, which is quite a lot lower than her 4 MP attack. That's why usually if you can't go for the overdrive, say if you just have her at luck 5, then just use her 4 MP, and that's basically it. So now I guess I'll show you a bit about my raid team. Obviously I don't have the most optimal raid team, but you know, I guess it's a good way of showing what the boss does and why say that, you know, maybe you don't want to use a buffer. So for my team, I'm using, this is my main DPS out of all the characters I have. Unfortunately, you know, she's the one that I have that does the most damage. So for DPS, your relics are usually just going to be Mighty Warrior, since Mighty Warrior does the most damage, but obviously there are other relics you can use, such as the new relic, but if you have a level 100 Mighty Warrior and the level 60 new relic, I'll probably still go with the level 100 Mighty Warrior. Now I'm also using a buffer because the only characters that are actually doing damage in my team is her, which does physical damage, and Slimeco, which also does physical damage. Though Slimeco is more of a debuffer, and the reason I have Neuronus here is survivability, because for my previous team, I used 2 DPS, like the standard team of 2 DPS, a buffer and a debuffer. However, my DPS don't always survive and I actually do a bit less damage because of the debuff from the raid boss. So I'll show you why Neuronus is very good in a minute here. Looks like I missed the raid boss, rip. So I'll go and start now. Now for Neuronus, I'm using a +4 aim relic, and the reason for that is because you want her paralysis or seal to hit to have as high chance of hitting as possible. With +4 aim, you have almost guaranteed but not exactly guaranteed chance to seal every round. However, paralysis is guaranteed but not for the first 2 rounds because he does have that resistance. So if you have a look at the information, he does have an 80% resistance to paralysis, so you know you're most likely not gonna hit it. So for your DPS, you usually just do what you do. Or if you're using Neuronus as the one to help you survive, and maybe as your debuff as well, if your team is purely magical, you obviously use that skill, and you go with that. So the most ideal one is obviously a paralysis on turn 1. From here, you can see none of them landed, unfortunately. So I'll be getting the AoE debuff. And this is why I would say you will want to have a character that's going for survival and a debuffer, because debuffer is usually stronger. And then maybe another DPS. For me, my DPS, I don't really have any other good DPS, so it's better just to use my buffer and boost my 1 DPS that can do somewhat of a damage as much as possible. And from here, because it didn't land, I will obviously use seal and paralysis again. Now if this did land, however, say if it's a seal, then I will use her venom attack, and then on the 3rd turn I will use the seal and paralysis again for the guaranteed paralysis. Because the seal does take away his skill, however he will still do his normal attack, which is AoE damage. And yeah, from there, Zero and Paralysis hit on turn 2. And if that happens to you, then for the rest of the turn with Neuronus, you would just use the Venom attack. Now obviously, this is the most optimal team, as I've said many times before. If you want to do good damage, you probably want at least one of either Solution or the new Nabe. And yeah, maybe Yuri as well if you do have her. But Yuri is still quite a bit behind the other two, who honestly just does super insane damage relatively to everyone else in this raid, basically. And yeah, for Slime Coat, I'm also using the Overdrive relic, and the reason for that is because her 3 MP does give a bit of overdrive, and at OD level 1, I'm just a tiny bit off from using her overdrive. So yeah. And that's it for my rating. Obviously, pretty bad damage considering it's only, 400,000. My usual damage is probably 450,000 if Neuronus gets Seal or Paralysis on first turn, which is what happens most of the time, but obviously I did get unlucky for this run. And yeah, so yeah, based on that showcase of the character, it's obviously a lot more understandable why you will want to go for a character to help you survive. So for me, that's Neuronus, and I would say for most teams, Neuronus is probably the best if you do have her. If not, then maybe go with something that have attack debuff and defense debuff, or another character that does seal, such as Nazarick Mare, or maybe even OG Sibus if you really have to. But yeah, I would say that's it for team composition for Raid. If you still have any questions, feel free to come to the Discord. I'm sure there are a lot of people, that have tested out Raid a bit more and can help you explain a bit. And if you don't want to do that, you could always just ask in the comment and I will try my best to explain it. And yeah, that's basically it for the Raid. I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.